mini solar scope and some recent observations on episode 487 of the Actual Astronomy Podcast. I'm Chris, and joining me is Shane. We are amateur astronomers who love looking up at the night sky, and this podcast is for everyone who enjoys going out under the stars. Um, have you been able to get out and do any observing, Shane?
Not really at night, but I've had the solar scope out, the hydrogen alpha solar scope. So did a little bit of that observing. In fact, some of that was yesterday, and I had the 40 millimeter double stack out. I left the 90 millimeter indoors. It's just the 40 millimeter is so much easier to take out. Tripod, telescope, everything in one hand. Whereas with the 90 millimeter, it's take out the tripod and then take out the TSA 102 and put it all together. And it's a little bit more involved, but there's been a lot of solar activity. There's been a lot of the KP index, I wouldn't say alerts, but certainly, some high activity for auroral phenomena. Although I haven't really gone out to look for any of that. But yeah, lots of detail on the sun, lots happening as always. So it's always, I always enjoy those observations.
You were
How
doing
about
some
yourself?
yard, you were doing some yard work and solar observing through a little bit of smoke, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So what I like to do, so we're recording on May 25th. Um, like that third week of May, I like to take the week off and then kind of get all of my yard work that I need to do for the year out of the way so I can enjoy summer. So yeah, spent the day staining a deck and kind of doing a few other things, and didn't have much energy for nighttime observing. I was pretty beat from being in the sun and actually doing physical labor, which I'm not used to being an office guy. But
Yeah.
anyway, I'm glad that that's basically done, and I can just enjoy the rest of the warm season.
Nice.
How about you? Have you done any observing?
Yeah, I was out last night for a few hours
Okay,
and what's that?
I just said okay.
Yeah, and did quite a bit. Wanted to keep, progressing through planetary nebula and took some other views of a pile of different objects. But I did a sketch of the Owl Nebula M97 up in Ursa Major.
Hmm.
And yeah, was able to see the eyes in the owl, not super clear, and kind of came and went, but definitely see a really large, the really large disk of that nebula. I mean, it's huge, eh?
Yeah, it's a really good size and good time of the year to be observing it. It's well positioned.
Yeah, exactly. So did a sketch of that one. Let me just call it up here, just so I have it here in front of me. So yeah, it's almost 10th magnitude, but it's really big. Where is says apparent size is so many arc seconds by arc or 3.4 by 3.3. But I think it's bigger than that. I think it's like something like a third the size of the full moon or something like that. And yeah, I could definitely see it. And at those sort of mid-range powers, definitely could start to make out that there was almost in a way looked like Jupiter to me, where it had like darker bands and lighter bands, but of course, much, much fainter.
Hmm.
And then I did an observation of, I kind of just sort of scrolled around the sky a little bit, looked at M64 and a few other things, but did a sketch of the Cat's Eye Nebula up
Okay.
in Draco. Yeah. And that's a really interesting nebula. I've observed it a few times with this scope, and it's the planetary nebula, but it looks like a almost like a spirograph drawing
Hmm.
to me more than like a cat's eye. And you see that very clearly in the images. Um, but I hadn't been able to see any real structure. And I'd done some reading actually. I think you had mentioned this that you had done some reading like of O'Meara and trying to do some of the same observations he's done in the
Hmm.
Deep Sky Treasures.
Hmm.
And he mentions using at least 300 power with it, and definitely below 300 power, you don't really see much. But once you get to 300 power or more, you can begin to see that spirograph feature
Oh, wow.
quite clearly. I was
Hmm.
surprised. I was really surprised. But there's a lot to see. One of the other things I wanted to try to see is to see if I could see there's a halo around, like a very faint halo around that nebula, around the cat's eye
Hmm.
that extends out, I don't know, a few arc minutes or something like that. But, I never really heard of anybody visually observing it much before.
Hmm.
And so I was kind of like thinking, probably not possible. Or I'd heard of somebody seeing some portions of it with like an 8 inch or 10 inch. But I have the multiple filter selection selector by Lumicon, so I can kind of flash in and out my O3 filter.
Yeah.
And when you do that, it actually looks like a large extended glow. And I had done and gone and looked at a pile of images before, and definitely the glow was brighter in the area it should have been brighter, fainter in the area it should have been fainter. And the cat's eye is around 10th magnitude or almost as faint. I think 9 point something. And and there's lots of other stars in the field that are that bright, and none of these other stars were giving that glow around them, or even slightly brighter stars don't give that glow around them. So it has to be that halo. And especially
Oh,
where
wow.
there's like a little bright section near a star, that's just above it. Well, according to my view last night, just above it, and could definitely see like a brighter portion in that area. But you could see the halo all the way around it, like very. I was going to say uniform. It's a circle, but you can actually detect some brighter and darker areas in it.
And the Halo, was that also using the same power, like real high power around 300 times?
No, no, that was with 50 power with the
Yeah.
22
Okay.
Nagler. Yeah.
You probably want as much light coming through as possible to see that, I would imagine.
Yeah, though I gotta say, I couldn't really see it that well at lower power. I think I
Mm.
used 27 at first.
Yep.
I don't think I could see it at 27.
Okay.
Um, so it's just, I find the 22 Nagler is pretty good. And I think what it boils down to is exit people,
Hmm. Hmm.
because I think there's like that critical zone of about a 4 millimeter exit pupil. And that's like 3.8 for me, I think. And that seems to match very well with my sight and what the telescope can do and what a nebula filter, an O3 filter can do for you. It seems like it treads a pretty good line. And I've read that before about people with f6 scopes and their preference for the 22 millimeter Nagler. I can really see that for sure.
Hmm. Hmm. Like deep sky objects, what I always find interesting is kind of that balance between magnification and exit pupil, and getting as
Mm.
much light into your eye as possible because sometimes you want, very low power to maximize the exit pupil and get as much light in there as possible, but in some cases you want a little more magnification even though it can sort of dim the image. And it's neat to find that balance, but it's also neat to play on both sides of the balance too, just to see how it changes.
I should say eighth magnitude. It's not ninth. It's 8.1. But yeah, I agree. Um, but there's like although it's eighth magnitude, it's small. Like the cat's eye is fairly small, but there is detail there. You
Hmm.
you just like Omira says, you just need to um, apply a lot of power. Like, and he even said in his 4 inch, he was using just over 300 power, and I didn't see anything below 300. Really, like maybe some hints. But once I put the 3.5 mil in at 308 power, I could start to clearly see that. I tried 432, which was too mushy, but at
Hmm.
350 power with the whatever that is, I think the 7 millimeter with 1.6, something like that. Yeah, I could definitely see like those almost looks like superimposed lobes, sort of one over top of the other. You could see that greater structure and a hole in the middle.
Hmm.
But I didn't see the central star. I think I kind of forgot to look for it, and because I was just so distracted by seeing that structure, and it seems so bluey green,
Hmm.
much more so than a lot of other nebula. And it's weird because eighth magnitude isn't super bright, but I guess it's in that scope, it's still bright enough. But that was so cool to see, having seen images of it so much over the years. I've never really seen that level of structure before that I could recall. Because typically in most scopes, when you don't have tracking, you just can't apply those powers very easily, although I know lots of people do, but I've always struggled with that. But anyway, really nice to have the tracking and to be able to do that and get a sketch of it.
Yeah, sounds like a really good observation, and sounds like a fun night overall too.
Yeah, and did a long observation of the veil, spent probably 20 minutes on that, just going back and forth between all the components and Pickering's triangle. And like you could really see like so much structure and detail. Even though it was only about like 50 or 60 degrees up, just incredible. Didn't do a sketch of it. I mean, I could have spent like the whole evening doing a sketch of the veil, which kind of want to do at some point. It's tough though. I've done a few sketches of it in the past and haven't been really satisfied with those just because there's so much fine detail visible.
Hmm.
Um, Took a look at the North American and Pelican nebulas. And again, like just could see so many different levels of dark nebula and bright nebula and different like levels of brightness across those nebulae, just so readily apparent. Was really cool, though. Can't see the whole thing in all one go with the 7 inch, sadly, like you can with the 5 inch. What one thing, and sort of in comparison, we like to talk about small instruments, Shane, and there's something I always enjoy looking at with the 5 inch, which is another globular cluster near, sort of forms a triangle between Antares M4, and then the target is NGC 6144, which is this globular cluster just above and in between those. I don't know if you've ever looked at it. It's fairly faint globular, but readily apparent in the 5 inch.
Yeah, I don't think I have.
Anyway, it's something I always use to kind of judge the sky conditions and everything. And last night was pretty good, especially by the time the Scorpion was high in the south, which is where this is. And I was shocked. Like I've mentioned this before, how much light the 7 inch seems to draw in versus other instruments. It just seems to give you like every photon and very concentrated. And I tried to see 6144 on another night that was maybe not quite as good as last night, and I couldn't see it. And I was kind of a bit surprised and a little bit put back by it because I'd so easily seen it in the 5 inch even from here, and so I put it in the field and then I used some higher power and I could see it. But what I realized is that the telescope and is bringing in so much light from Antares that with a 7 inch refractor, the brightness of Antares overwhelms that globular cluster versus in the 5 inch. Antares is fairly bright, but you can easily see 6144. I just thought you'd enjoy that observation because there's a target that through a slightly larger instrument is more difficult to see until you get it out of the field. So with Antares in the field, I really couldn't see 6144. But as
Hmm.
soon as I dropped or put the power up to 50 power, and then I think I used up to 90 power in it, could start to make out that globular. But it's subtle. It's a faint globular, and because of that, it's really best observed at lower power. And so there's a really good example of where a smaller instrument can see something that's faint easier than a larger instrument of pretty much exactly the same type and quality.
Yeah, that's interesting. It doesn't happen all of the time in astronomy, but there are
Mm.
times when that applies, and it kind of highlights why it's nice to have a couple of different telescopes that allow you to be versatile like that.
Yeah. And I always wonder, like sometimes, like, one of the objects I observed years back, haven't observed it recently, is that Leo 1 dwarf galaxy up off Regulus. And I'd seen people struggling with it with various sized instruments, but we looked at it one night, my 5 inch and Clark Muir's, I think he has a 12. And we thought it was like about the same. And I think that's why. I think sometimes maybe that's why people might say, oh, with the smaller instrument, you can, they can beat a larger instrument. And in certain respects, that's true. Another target I went for, once I noticed that, was I think it's Palomar 5, which has an NGC number, I forget, by V1, V2 Sagittarii.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 5 inch, it's moderately easy. But in the 7 inch, I don't think I could see it because those stars, as singular points of light, are like overwhelming the spot because it's right next to, I think, V2 Sagittarii. So it's interesting just to note the differences that when you do go to a larger scope, some of those targets can become more of a challenge. Probably you need to go to like a 16-inch telescope to kind of then like sort of regain some of that ability to see those things. Then your smaller field of view makes it easier to get the nearby stars out of the field that you're trying to take a look at.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very
Hmm.
cool.
Hmm. Yeah, I took a look at M27 using various powers and took a look at M5 and then kind of towards the end just did a run up of Messier 8 and the Trifid and like those objects just look like black and white photos through a 7-inch refractor on a dark night at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then took a look at Messier 17, the Swan Nebula, and you could just see like so much detail and structure and like the huge sort of pond that meanders out the backside of it, and then Messier 16 and some sharpless objects up in through there, and the M24 star cloud, quote unquote. Yeah, it was really, really nice, really great conditions. Surprisingly, since we had a lot of sort of smoke and haze, but it had sort of mostly cleared out. It was mostly cleared out by sunset, just sort of limiting the last 5 or 6 degrees at the horizon, and then I thought the stars might be a little muted. I went to bed and then got up at 11:30 and went out, and I was kind of surprised how bright the stars were because I thought they might be a little bit muted. Another star I looked at just as a singular star was the Herschel's Garnet star up in Cephus. That was
Okay,
that
okay.
was
I
pretty nice too.
Did we try that one night when I was out?
Yeah,
Yeah, I thought so.
yeah, I looked at that one quite a bit. It's a bright orange star in and amongst the IC 1396 nebula, which is where the Elephant Trunk Nebula is. And I kind of, viewed around in there. I could see some of those dark nebulae and maybe some brighter portions of IC 1396. But I think again, that's one that works much better at low power, especially like the 50 millimeter works really well on IC 1396. Can't really see the elephant trunk. But last night I thought I detected maybe portions of the elephant trunk type structure. And then what else? There was something else I was going to mention, but yeah, it was M64. Looked at that, could not see the dark spot in it or anything, but it was pretty good. And oh yeah, I went up through Cassiopeia and tried to look for things. That was really towards the end, and when I decided to pack it in, I could kind of start to hear the birds chirping at 2:15, and I was having trouble starting to figure out what I was doing and where I wanted to go and what I was looking at. I was just like, I just can't observe anymore. I'm just done. And
Yeah.
plus the birds are starting to chirp, which means in 15 or 20 minutes, the sunlight is going to start to interfere. So I packed it in and came down and a little bit disappointed. I kind of had hoped to get three planetary nebula sketched, but I did three sketches. I just did two of the Cat's Eye and Draco, and then one of the Owl Nebula. But I was really thrilled to get lots of detail on both of those because I've observed them lots. I've just struggled to see those details, but kind of on really on your prompting and the conversations that we've had both on and off the podcast, Shane, and I really thank you for that, is to kind of go back and read, I think a lot of those observing guides like Stephen O'Meara and Sue French and Walter Scott Houston and um, Robert Burnham Jr. and all those, you can really gain a lot. Oh, and Longenbuehl and Skiff's book, I've been reading the observations they've done of planetary nebula as well. It's although it's kind of like a lot of things, it's easy to read about those observations, and then when you get out there at the telescope, it is tough to do that kind of observing, I find anyway. So I find that I'm learning a lot through this process of getting to know this large instrument that can, both handle the high power and then track it as well. Anyway, just sort of a bit of an interesting adventure there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I'm glad you shared that.
Yeah. Did you want to read Chris's question and maybe respond to it, and then I'll
Sure.
conclude and read Mike's observation?
Yeah, Chris said, "Hey guys, I hope all is well. Last year I bought the Borg Mini 6150 for the Eclipse. So for our listeners, that's the Mini Borg 50 that you and I talk a lot about, Chris." And Chris Klein goes on to say, I'm trying to use it for sunspot observing with a white light filter. I use a set of Meade superplossals for my quark chromosphere, and I'm trying to use them for the sunspots as well. I'm struggling to get them to come to focus. One requires a longer light path, which is easy enough to rectify, but the rest require a shorter path, and I don't have any more inward travel. I have the Borg helical focuser, and there's no extension tube on the scope. Any suggestions? What else here? The eyepiece that I can get to focus is too low power, and I can't see any detail of the sunspots. I have other scopes that I can use, but I'm going to embark on the Sunspotter observing program for the Astronomical League and wanted to keep the small Borg readily available for quick sessions. Um, it's kind of hard to say for sure because with these Borgs, there's so many different setups. If you have the kind of the stock Borg Mini 50, it has that like a sliding part of the OTA, like for kind of rough focus. Um, you could remove that and buy like I don't even know how to say it. I guess parts of the tube. Like Borg will sell the 50 millimeter like tube sections in different lengths, and I don't know what they all are, but you can basically buy enough sections and adapters to attach them together to achieve the tube length that you desire. And what I've done on the Borgs, or at least with one of my Mini 50s, is I got rid of that coarse focus, like the sliding tube, and made sure I could reach focus with the eyepiece that required the most amount of inward travel. And then if there's any eyepieces that wouldn't reach focus and they need a longer tube, I would just put like a 1.25 inch extension into the diagonal to add some space to achieve focus. So that is the only real suggestion I have there, is just to buy, like whatever Borg kind of OTA sections that you needed to get the right focal length or the right tube length to allow your shortest eyepiece to come to focus. Anything to
Yeah.
add, Chris, or any other
No,
ideas?
there's like you said, there's just a lot of different ways you can set those scopes up. Yeah. You can kind of get those rings and just kind of keep adding and removing rings
Hmm.
as you see fit. I find it best just to buy a lot of different board parts, and then like when I got my 54, I was able to configure like a whole different scope with it. And I think I still have enough parts for the 50. So I have two 50 millimeter scopes, I think now, ish.
Hmm. Hmm.
So yeah, yeah.
Another thing he could do is like find a zoom eyepiece that will work in there. And then, with the zoom eyepiece, you really don't have to change the focus all that much as you're going through the zoom range. And that might help sort of achieve the same thing and probably end up costing about the same or less because some of those Borg pieces or adapters are not inexpensive. And if you need multiples, they can add up pretty fast.
And then it's tough to switch it.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Like you don't really switch that to me anyway, you don't switch those Borg adapters and pieces during observing. You sort of set it
no.
up in the house however you need it. And then, that's how you're going to use it in the field.
I've tried that before. It does not work very
Hmm.
well
Yeah, I
to
bet.
be monkeying around with stuff in the dark like that is
Yeah.
not fun.
Yeah. It can be frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. Neat to see somebody else with one of those little scopes going though.
Yeah, and they're ideal for his use case there, of like quick sunspot observing with a white light filter, because they are so small, but so capable. And I'm sure once Chris gets it working, he'll be pretty happy.
Yeah, I'm always so surprised that they didn't really become such a big thing because in my mind they're really nice as a almost like an well they are like an alternative to a binocular in a way because you're on a tripod so it's nice and stable. You can move your powers around. You can look at planets and the moon and stuff like that. But then for like really large deep sky objects from a dark site, especially if someone's going on a trip, like you can see the Barnard's loop super easy with them. You can see like the belt of Orion and the sword of Orion all in the same field, if you set it up right. And like I said earlier, IC 1396 um, is easy. It just pops out when you're sweeping around with the 50 millimeter because it concentrates the light so much because you're at like 7 or 8 power or whatever, They're
Well,
really, really neat.
they are, and I think maybe what worked against them, or why people didn't, really gravitate towards them, it's a fast achromat, which kind of has a bad reputation in the astronomy community. But when you look through these things, like the first time I looked through mine, I couldn't believe how well it performed. It was
Mm,
phenomenal. And I was expecting a view similar to like the 50 millimeter finders that come with a lot of Cinta telescopes,
yes,
and they're
exactly.
like they work, but they're not awesome, and
No.
like there's a lot of edge distortion and a lot of other issues that you wouldn't ever dream of using one of those probably as a like full-time observing instrument. It's just a finder. And so I think that played into it. And then just the cost, like I forget what they were brand new, but even on the used market, I think these mini Borgs are probably in that $200 range, maybe
Hmm.
250-ish, depending on how it's all configured. And that's a lot of money for a 50 millimeter achromat. And
Yeah.
I think again that works against it. However, if you ever look through one of these things, then I think the value proposition and everything just adds up. Like it makes sense because they're so good.
Yeah, well, I ended up buying another because I bought the 54 as the
Yeah.
finder for my 7-inch f6 Achromat. And so I've really gone pretty deep into the Achromat purple haze or whatever you want to call them. I have all these lilacs that are blooming right now, which is very appropriate for my instrument, I suppose.
Hmm.
Yeah, if you look at bright objects under low power, that's where you see the chromatic aberration. But like when we were looking at the moon under, 300 magnification, you don't see it because you magnify it out, right? That's
Hmm.
like how the design works. And and so it's kind of applying it in the right way. Like it's pretty surprising. I think that yeah, you can see color, but it's I think like seeing just the seeing conditions themselves are way more impactful than like the color of the objects. But as well, like say looking at Vega, couldn't really see much color around that. Anything brighter than Vega, you will, but anything about Vega or less. So I think around zero magnitude or fainter, you just don't see any color. In fact, I find the color in the stars much more apparent. Of course, maybe it's slightly better in the Apochroma of 7 inches, but yeah, it's just not that impactful in the ways that people tend to talk about it, eh?
Hmm. Agreed.
I don't like it when people kind of bash up on any type of instrument. My favorite example is when I was doing astronomy courses, and I still do them from time to time. But I remember I was encouraging people to take binoculars out, and we went and did a binocular session to look at a lunar eclipse. And somebody brought these binoculars and kind of sheepishly asked me to kind of give my assessment of them. And they were just like a standard Bushnell binocular, like a lot of people just sort of have sitting around on their window shelf or something, you know?
Hmm.
And they had taken a birding course, and the person who taught the birding course kind of told them that basically those binoculars weren't worth looking through and they should just throw them in the
Ooh.
garbage and get a new pair. And I was like, no, that's not true at all. These are probably like 95% as good as like the most expensive binocular, like a Swarovski or something. And I mean,
Hmm.
to be honest, a lot of people probably couldn't tell the difference anyway. So,
Yeah. Hmm. That's wild.
yeah.
So,
Cool.
do you
All
want
right.
to get into Mike's observing
I
report?
do. Strangely enough, Mike, we're just getting to Mike's observation and he's like calling me, but I'll have to return his call later. It's kind of weird, eh? Yeah, so Mike sent a grasslands observing report. He was at the grasslands event last night. I wasn't able to make it this year for a variety of reasons. Usually I like to go. Um, and he said that they had clouds that persisted until after 11 o'clock last night. So they started getting some good sized sucker holes at 11:30, and then the park started using their 10-inch reflector, but there were only a few visitors left at that point, and they showed the Mars M13 and a few other objects. But then everybody packed up, including the park staff, and left at midnight. But Mike stayed up, and he said things started getting pretty good around 1 a.m. He was able to observe Virgo and the Leo galaxies in his binoculars and set up his 12-inch and got a really good hour in looking at Messier 4 on both the binoculars, which are 15 by 50 Canons, and his 12-inch Orion scope, and looked at M62, which is a globular cluster on the Scorpius Ophiuchus border. And yeah, he said really great night looking at the Milky Way, and let's see, during a clear break, he was able to see M53, the double cluster, and the veil. So he and I were probably looking at the veil at about the same time. And then he went on and looked at the globulars M14, M10, M12, and I think that's IC4665, which is the summer beehive. And then he went on to look at open cluster M11, globular M15, M5, the Ring Nebula, and M109. Interesting pick for a galaxy in that mix. And then did a number of Coma cluster galaxies. And then he put a little DID-Zs. I think that must be like Doties, or else he fell asleep and he was just zzz.
He had a really productive night, given conditions weren't the best with the clouds kind of moving in and out and creating some sucker holes. That's a good night of observing.
Mm. Yeah, it's too bad. I mean, originally it looked like it was going to be clouded out here and it was going to be clear down there, and then the weather kind of flipped, and then we got that smoke, and I thought, well, they're going to at least have some clear sky, and we might not see much of anything. In fact, there was a small part of me that thought not even to set the alarm to get up. But I did anyway, and then got up at 11:30 and went out, and I was like, whoa, it was really, really good. So maybe we lost like 2/10 of a magnitude or something, but otherwise it was pretty good.
Yeah,
Pretty
I
good
was
conditions.
hoping to go to Grasslands this past week. I had it booked off, but we had a lot of rain and as I mentioned on the previous episode, I like to take that week off to get a whole bunch of yard work done. And so combined with my desire to get the yard work done and a less than favorable grasslands forecast, I decided to stay home.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it was a good week to kind of just be around. Certainly ended up getting some rain and some pretty cold conditions there on a number of nights and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
days.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So hopefully we're into better weather now, and although we're getting more into the perpetual twilight, so I'm definitely on the nights where I observe going to be doing the go to bed, get up at midnight, and try to get that hour to hour and a quarter of observing in under the near perpetual twilight and then perpetual twilight here in the next few weeks around the summer solstice. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, keep plugging away at the planetaries. I was really surprised at the cat's eye. That's something people should try based on these experiences is to, really try improving the power. And it's funny because for me, I find I never really would have tried that before until I had the tracking. And then I was chatting with Royce, who I think we read an email on in a recent episode, and he's been using similar powers, but in a telescope that he built and hand tracking and doing sketches like that and videoing them as well. And I have just so much respect for somebody who can do all of that. Like I was thinking last night, I could barely get two sketches off with the tracking mount, and I'm not videoing my my observations. So somebody who can sort of do all those three things or four things at once, that's pretty good. But going back to what we were talking about in the previous episode with Peter and talking about his experience, it's just how I keep learning both myself from our conversations and conversations with listeners that really makes me enjoy doing all this. It's really cool. It's a lot of fun. It's kind of really helped bring along my observing. And honestly, I probably never would have bought a 7-inch Acromat or even my property out here if it wasn't for the podcast and in particular the noodling of one in particular listener who has a YouTube channel to kind of get me off that fence and to kind of make some moves. What do you really want to do with your astronomy kind of thing? So, really really nice to have this community of listeners who want to come on the show and write us and give us some advice. It's really been a lot of fun.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Cool. Anything to add, Shane? Any observing plans for June on your agenda? I guess this will be out in almost mid-June by the time this one gets dropped.
Yeah, no, not really. I'll try to get in some lunar observing and some noctilucent cloud observing, hopefully,
Mm.
if any pop up. And yeah, just sort of take it one day at a time. I don't I don't put a lot of pressure on myself to observe in June just because of the perpetual twilight, but anything that I can kind of fit in, like again, kind of that lunar observing, is a lot of fun in June for me.
One of the things that I think about, I can't remember if I mentioned this before, or maybe it was Mike I was chatting with, but or could have even been a listener. I think about when I'm reading whatever I'm reading, old observations and people reference because I usually don't read like the original Herschel or Messier works. Um, how many objects those individuals found in June, and they were at or about the same latitude. In fact, we'd be about halfway in between where, or maybe a little bit close to where Herschel was, but about halfway in between where Messier was observing at around 49 degrees, and where Herschel was observing at around 51 degrees north latitude, and we're sort of right in between at 50 point whatever, 50.5 or something like that. So I often like to think about that in terms of trying to get myself motivated to go out because they were facing similar conditions. Plus, I think perhaps at least for Herschel, the weather in England may not have been as good as the weather that we get in the summer here.
Hmm. Hmm.
Cool. All right. Well, with that, unless there's anything else, maybe I can just sort of wrap it up here with you.
Sounds good.
Please subscribe, share the show with other stargazers you know, and send us your show ideas, observations, and questions to actualastronomy@gmail.com.
Thank you everyone for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the show. If you are interested in more information, would like to contact us, or if you would like to support the podcast, check out our website, actualastronomy.com.